Imagine being a 6-year-old child, ripped from your family, marched for hundreds of miles, and sold to strangers across the ocean. That was the beginning of Venture Smith's life, a boy born in Africa who was captured, chained, and dragged into the brutal world of slavery in colonial America. His real name was Brotier Furrow, but the world would come to know him as Venture, a name tied to the man who first purchased him. But unlike countless others whose stories were silenced, Venture refused to let his voice be erased. He endured beatings, humiliation, and endless labor. Yet every coin he earned, every ounce of strength he could spare, he saved toward one goal: to buy back his freedom. His journey would not end there. He would fight to free his wife and children, building a life that defied the system that tried to crush him. In an age when enslaved people were treated as property, Venture Smith stood as proof of resilience, determination, and survival. And in 1798, he dictated his autobiography, one of the first narratives of an African man enslaved in America. His words, raw and unflinching, still echo today. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a stolen childhood turned into a legacy of freedom. The untold story of Venture Smith. Before Venture Smith was Venture, before he was chained, beaten, and forced into a life of bondage, he was simply Brotier Furrow, a child of Africa. Born around 1729 in what is now Guinea, West Africa, his earliest years were shaped not by slavery, but by family, tradition, and belonging. His father, a man of status and wealth, was a leader among his people. His household, as Venture would later recall, was filled with the dignity of kinship and the rhythm of African life. Brotier's childhood was not unlike that of any boy his age. He ran freely through the village, surrounded by cousins, hearing stories of warriors, ancestors, and the land they cultivated. His father owned cattle, held influence, and provided stability for the family. For a time, there was no shadow of the horrors to come, but Africa in the early 18th century was a place entangled in turmoil. Rival clans and kingdoms fought bitter wars, many of which fed into the growing demand of the Atlantic slave trade. European merchants waited on the coast, eager for human cargo, while African raiders and middlemen supplied captives in exchange for guns, cloth, and rum. Brotier's community could not have imagined that this distant trade, across an ocean he had never seen, would one day consume their own child. When Brotier was just 6 years old, violence shattered his world. One night, raiders descended on his village. The sounds of screaming, the clash of weapons, and the glow of fire replaced the peaceful rhythm of family life. Brotier was seized, torn from his father, his mother, and everything familiar. He remembered the brutal journey, forced marches, hunger, fear. His father, unwilling to submit, was killed before his eyes. That memory, the sight of his father's death, would remain carved into his mind forever. From that moment, Brotier's childhood ended. He was no longer a son or a free boy of Africa. He was a captive, a commodity. Stripped of kinship and security, he became part of a pipeline of human lives bound for the Atlantic coast. The journey to the slave forts was itself a nightmare. Hundreds of miles on foot, chained or roped together, children and adults alike driven forward under threat of whips and spears. Disease struck some, exhaustion claimed others. The captors had no mercy. Those who could not keep up were left behind, sometimes dead, sometimes worse. Brotier, still only a boy, survived by sheer will and the instinct to endure. Finally, he reached the coastal trading posts, grim stone fortresses where human beings were held like cattle until European ships arrived. The smell of sickness filled the air. Prisoners were crammed into dark cells with barely enough room to breathe. In those days, Children like Brotier were prized. They were easier to transport, easier to train, and their lifespans could mean years of forced labor in the colonies. It was here that Brotier's identity began to be erased. The name his parents had given him was soon discarded. He would be Venture, not because he chose it, but because Robinson Mumford, the Rhode Island merchant who purchased him, saw him as part of a venture investment. His humanity was reduced to a transaction. His body, his labor, his very life became an entry in someone else's ledger. But the boy who would become Venture Smith carried something with him across the ocean. Memory. Though enslavers tried to strip him of family, name, and past, he never forgot that he had once been a free child of Africa, the son of a proud father. That seed of memory would be his anchor in the years to come, the ember that fueled his determination to reclaim freedom, no matter how impossible it seemed. Thus begins the story of Venture Smith, a story that starts not in America, not on a plantation, but in the green hills of Africa, with a childhood violently stolen. After days, perhaps weeks, of being marched from his home toward the coast, the young boy once known as Brotier found himself standing at the edge of the Atlantic. Before him rose a sight more terrifying than anything he had ever seen. Massive wooden ships, their dark hulls looming like floating fortresses. For Venture Smith, only 6 years old, this was the threshold into a world of unimaginable suffering. The slave forts along the West African coast were already suffocating places. Damp stone dungeons where captives waited in chains, crammed shoulder to shoulder in the dark. But the ships were worse. To the European traders who ran them, these vessels were not carrying people. They were carrying cargo. Brotier and hundreds of others were forced aboard, stripped of dignity, branded not with names, but with numbers and value. The Atlantic crossing was known as the Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangular trade that carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton back to Europe. For those chained in the holds, the passage was nothing less than a voyage through hell. Below deck, Venture and the others were chained together in rows, lying on bare wooden planks, packed so tightly that turning over was impossible. The stench of vomit, sweat, and human waste filled the air. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, smallpox, and fever claimed lives by the dozens. Each morning, the crew dragged out bodies and threw them overboard. Sharks, already trained to follow slave ships, circled in bloody anticipation. The young boy, once free in Africa, now endured a nightmare where the cries of the dying and the wailing of children echoed endlessly in the dark. Food was little more than beans, rice, or gruel, often spoiled, often forced down captives' throats with whips if they resisted. Some refused to eat, preferring death to slavery, but the crew would pry their mouths open and jam in the food. Others attempted suicide, throwing themselves into the sea, seeking the freedom of death. Yet, in the face of despair, there were moments of quiet defiance. Songs hummed softly in African tongues, rhythms tapped out on wooden planks. The memory of home, of families, villages, ancestors, lived on in fragments of culture carried across the ocean. Even in chains, the enslaved found ways to remind each other they were still human. For Venture, too young to fully grasp the scope of the journey, survival became instinct. He remembered his father's bravery, his family's dignity, and held on to them in silence. Each day alive was a refusal to let his captors erase him. The Middle Passage could last 6, 8, even 10 weeks, depending on storms and winds. For Venture and his shipmates, each day blurred into the next, the creak of the wood, the crash of the waves, the cries in the dark. By the time the ship reached the American colonies, perhaps a third of those who had boarded in Africa were dead. When the vessel finally anchored in Rhode Island, Venture Smith was no longer Brotier Furrow, the child of a respected African leader. He was a commodity to be sold. At auction, Robinson Mumford, a wealthy merchant, purchased him. Mumford gave him the name Venture, not as a kindness, but as a reminder that the boy was part of a venture, an investment. His life was reduced to profit. Thus, the Middle Passage ended. But slavery had only just begun. Venture's childhood was over. Ahead lay decades of backbreaking labor, humiliation, and the fight to reclaim freedom. The Middle Passage was not just a journey across the sea. It was the deliberate destruction of identity, culture, and humanity. Yet within Venture, the spark of resistance remained. Though his name was stolen and his freedom denied, the memory of Africa still lived within him, a memory that no chain, no ship, no master could erase. When Venture Smith stepped onto the shores of Rhode Island, he was no longer Brotier Furrow, son of an African leader. At just 6 years old, he was a commodity. Robinson Mumford, the man who purchased him, renamed him Venture, a cruel reminder that the boy's life was tied to Mumford's financial venture in human trafficking. From the very start, his existence in America was defined not by who he was, but by what he was worth. For Venture, childhood vanished quickly under the weight of enslavement. In Mumford's household, he was expected to labor like a grown man. Even as a boy, he performed endless tasks, hauling water, carrying firewood, tending animals, and working in the fields. There was no gentleness, no allowance for youth. Every mistake, every moment of fatigue brought punishment. The winters of New England were brutal for a child who had grown up in the warmth of Africa. Venture later recalled the bitter cold, the thin clothing, and the gnawing hunger that followed him day after day. He was not alone in this suffering. Countless enslaved children were forced to grow up quickly, their small hands blistered by tools, their backs scarred by whips. Childhood was stripped away, replaced by survival. Yet, even in bondage, Venture's resilience began to reveal itself. He was strong, unusually strong for his age, and as he grew older, this strength became legendary. Neighbors and masters alike would later describe him as a man of towering size and force. But more than his body, it was his mind that set him apart. Venture observed, listened, and learned. He picked up English, not from classrooms, but from orders barked at him, conversations overheard, and the cruel language of command. Mumford, like many masters, exploited his enslaved laborers for profit. Venture was often hired out to work for others, his wages going entirely into his master's pocket. It was an early lesson in injustice. Venture's sweat and toil enriching men who would never recognize his humanity. But beneath that injustice, a seed was planted. Venture began to see the value of labor, the worth of money, and the possibility, however distant, of using both to reclaim his freedom. Life in bondage was not just about work, it was about constant humiliation. Venture was reminded at every turn that he was property. He could be beaten, sold, or traded at will. He had no say in where he lived or what he did. For a child who remembered the dignity of his African father, these degradations cut deep. Still, Venture endured. As he grew into adolescence, his body hardened by labor, he began to dream of more than survival. He dreamed of freedom. That dream, fragile yet unyielding, would shape the course of his life, but childhood under slavery left scars. Venture would later recall the cruelty, the betrayals, the loneliness of being torn from family. These memories would fuel his determination to escape bondage, not by running, but by something far more difficult: buying himself and his family out of slavery. In these early years, Venture learned two lessons that would define him. First, The system of slavery was designed to crush him, to grind him into silence and submission. Second, he would never allow it to succeed. He would endure, he would labor, and he would one day seize back his freedom. The boy who had once run free in the fields of Africa was now a servant in a strange land. But within him, the ember of defiance burned quietly, waiting for the moment when it would ignite into a flame. As Venture Smith grew from boyhood into adolescence, the chains around him did not loosen. They only grew heavier. By his teenage years, he had already lived longer in bondage than he ever had in freedom. His memories of Africa, though vivid, were now distant echoes. What remained immediate was the grinding reality of life under slavery in colonial New England. Venture's strength became both a weapon for survival and a curse. By the time he was a young man, his size and power were remarked upon by everyone who saw him. He could lift loads that most men could not, split wood with ease, and labor from dawn until nightfall without collapsing. Masters valued this strength, not as a testament to his spirit, but as proof of his market value. To them, he was muscle, a beast of burden, yet strength alone could not shield him from cruelty. Venture was sold again, this time to Thomas Stanton, one of the many white men who would profit from his body. Each sale reminded him of the fragility of his existence. He belonged to no one, but was claimed by everyone. He could be uprooted in an instant, his labor transferred, his life disrupted. His humanity was ignored, but his value was always calculated. It was during this period that Venture found a glimmer of personal joy. He married a woman named Meg, also enslaved. For two people denied so much, marriage was an act of quiet resistance, a claim to dignity and family in a system built to strip them of both. Their union would be tested by hardship, but it gave Venture something slavery could not touch: the will to fight not only for himself, but for those he loved. Marriage deepened Venture's determination. Freedom was no longer just about his own survival. It was about protecting his wife, and later, his children. He wanted them to live without chains, to grow without fear of being sold away. But the price of such a dream was staggering. To purchase himself, his wife, and eventually his family, Venture would need sums of money that few free laborers could hope to save, let alone an enslaved man with no rights, no wages of his own, and a system designed to keep him in poverty. Still, he did not give up. Venture began to scheme, to save, to seize every opportunity to earn a coin. Masters often hired out enslaved men, renting their labor to neighbors or businesses. While the wages officially belonged to the master, sometimes a fraction could be kept by the enslaved man. Venture turned every odd job, every small chance, into a step toward the impossible, buying his freedom. But even this path was lined with betrayal. Masters cheated him, pocketed what he had earned, or raised the price of his freedom at the last moment. Venture would later recall the bitterness of working tirelessly, handing over money, and still being treated as nothing more than property. His strength could break stones, but it could not break the greed of those who owned him. And yet, through all of this, Venture's determination hardened. If slavery was a battle of endurance, he would endure longer. If it was a test of will, he would not break. Even as a man in chains, Venture began to imagine himself as free. The transition from boy to man was not marked by birthdays or milestones. It was marked by lashes, by betrayals, by the knowledge that every inch of progress toward freedom could be stolen in an instant. But it was also marked by resolve. Venture's identity as a husband and father gave him a mission larger than himself. In his heart, he carried two truths: that he had once been a free child of Africa, and that one day, against all odds, he would be a free man again. By the time Venture Smith reached adulthood, He was no longer simply enduring slavery. He was planning his escape from it. Not by flight into the woods, not by uprisings with weapons, but by something more grueling, more uncertain. The slow, grinding path of buying his own freedom. In the world of 18th century New England, freedom was dangled before enslaved people like a cruel mirage. Masters sometimes promised liberty in exchange for enormous sums of money. Some so high, they seemed designed to be unreachable. For most, it was an illusion, a false hope. But Venture, through force of will and iron determination, made the impossible his life's mission. Every spare moment became an opportunity. Venture took on extra tasks when hired out. He cut wood, hauled stone, labored in fields, and fished in rivers, all under the harsh gaze of overseers. Each job was grueling, but each coin mattered. He saved with single-minded purpose, resisting the temptations of despair. Even when cheated out of his earnings, he started again. The struggle was not only against his masters, it was against a system built to ensure he never succeeded. Prices for his freedom shifted without warning. Promises were broken. Time after time, he scraped together sums only to see them swallowed by deceit. Venture later wrote that he suffered many impositions, injuries, and abuses from white men who exploited his desperation. His strength, his labor, his honesty, all used against him, yet he did not yield. Venture's resolve was fueled by more than his own survival. By now, he was a husband and father. His wife Meg and their children were still enslaved, vulnerable to being sold away at any moment. Freedom for Venture alone meant little. Freedom for his family was everything. The thought of securing their safety gave him a reason to endure humiliation after humiliation. There were nights when his body ached so badly he could barely stand. Days when betrayal left him broken with rage. But each morning, he rose again. In his mind, every blow of the axe, every stone lifted, every field plowed was a step toward a day when no man could call him property. Slowly, painfully, the impossible began to take shape. Venture scraped together larger and larger sums, approaching the moment when he might buy back his body and his name. The path was long, and it would demand everything he had. But for the first time since his capture as a child, Venture could glimpse the possibility of reclaiming his life. The struggle for freedom had begun. And for Venture Smith, it was not simply a personal battle. It was a war against a system that had stolen his childhood, broken his family, and reduced him to a number. Each coin he saved was an act of defiance. Each day he endured was proof that slavery could not extinguish his will. The path to freedom was not a straight line. For Venture Smith, every step forward seemed followed by betrayal. His strength, his honesty, his relentless labor, all became tools others used against him. Masters and traitors dangled freedom as a promise, only to snatch it away at the last moment. Venture later recalled these cruelties with bitterness. On more than one occasion, after years of saving, he offered the agreed-upon price for his liberty, only to have his enslaver change the terms, demand more, or deny the deal altogether. It was slavery's greatest trick, to hold freedom within sight, then raise the cost until it broke the spirit. For many, this endless shifting of the goal was enough to crush hope, but not for Venture. Though anger burned in him, he refused to surrender. Each betrayal fueled his determination. If they demanded more, he would earn more. If they cheated him, he would start again. Venture's body bore the marks of beatings, yet his spirit remained unbroken. The punishments he endured were not just physical. At times, when he resisted unfair treatment, he was imprisoned, shackled, humiliated, locked away. Punishments meant to teach obedience. Instead, They deepened his resolve. He had already survived the destruction of his childhood, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and decades of servitude. What could they do now to destroy his will? Still, these years tested him to the core. The cruelty of false promises was heavy. Imagine laboring for years, saving every possible coin, only to be told that your effort was worthless. Imagine watching others profit from your strength while your family remained in chains. That was Venture's reality. Yet he did not rebel with open violence. His resistance was quieter, but no less powerful. He resisted by saving again after every loss. He resisted by refusing to let betrayal extinguish his hope. He resisted by imagining a day when his wife Meg and his children would walk free beside him. In these moments of betrayal, we see the essence of Venture Smith's legacy. Resilience. Not the resilience of passive endurance, but the resilience of defiance. The refusal to give in to despair. His entire life was a rebellion against the system that sought to erase him. The betrayals scarred him deeply, but they also hardened his resolve. Venture came to understand that freedom would not be given. It would have to be seized, coin by coin, sacrifice by sacrifice, no matter how many times the goalposts moved. And so, he pressed on. His body, massive and unyielding, became a symbol of his will. His heart, scarred yet steady, carried him forward. Venture Smith was not yet free, but he had made a vow to himself, his wife, and his children. No matter how many betrayals, he would not stop until he had purchased not just his life, but theirs as well. The struggle was far from over. But Venture had already proven one truth. Slavery could chain his body, but it could not chain his determination. Freedom did not arrive for Venture Smith with fanfare. It came in the clink of coins, in numbers scratched on paper, in bargains struck across a table where one man's body was the merchandise. For years he had carried this goal like a stone in his chest. Now the day had finally come to test whether endurance could be turned into emancipation. By this time, Venture had been sold more than once. Each transfer reminded him that he could be moved like a tool, valued only for the work wrung from his hands. Eventually, he came under the control of a master whose name he would later take as his own. Smith. Not out of affection, but because the world demanded surnames and the system provided only those of enslavers. The irony was bitter. To walk toward freedom, he had to speak the name of a man who claimed him. The price set for his liberty was staggering, an amount that would have taken most free laborers years to earn, and which an enslaved man was never meant to reach. That was the cruelty built into the bargain. The numbers were designed to break hope. Venture understood it and prepared anyway. He had already spent seasons hiring himself out when permitted, cutting cordwood, hauling stone, mending fences, plowing, fishing. Work that left his bones aching and his palms raw. Every side job, every night hour, every winter day that numbed his fingers brought him a little closer to a sum the world told him was impossible. When he laid down his first payments, the goalposts shifted. Fees appeared. Tallies were corrected. Small debts were added, like pebbles dropped in his pocket until it felt like a boulder. He had seen this play before. Promise the chance to buy liberty, then inflate the cost when the enslaved man grew too close to purchase it. Venture swallowed the rage, counted again, and kept saving. Betrayal had not stopped him before. It would not stop him now. At last, the day arrived. In a cramped room where accounts were kept and people were inventoried, Venture stacked his hard-won money on the table. The room smelled of ink and lamp smoke. He felt the burn of eyes on his shoulders, the measuring look that had followed him since childhood, the gaze that calculated his strength into profit. A document was brought out. A witness, a signature, the scratch of a quill as if it were carving a doorway into the future. There are moments when freedom is thunder, crowds, shouts, flags. This was not that. For Venture, freedom sounded like paper sliding across wood. It felt like the slow release of a breath he had been holding for decades. He did not weep. There was no audience to cheer him. He simply stood, a man who had purchased the right to his own life and felt the room steady under his feet. But the price of freedom was never only a number. It was the years of labor taken without consent. It was the scars that never fully healed. It was the lost childhood, the father's voice silenced in Africa, the mother's face remembered only in flashes. Buying back his body did not restore the time already stolen. It only stopped the theft from continuing. And even then, the work was far from finished. Freedom for Venture alone meant little if his wife and children remained in chains. He had seen families ripped apart on auction blocks, had watched mothers hold their children with a terror that spoke of sales to come. Venture would not be a free man who walked past that fear. He would be a free man who turned and faced it. So he returned to the same brutal arithmetic. Negotiations, prices set, promises that could be broken. He worked as if pursued by wolves. He hired his strength to anyone who would pay honestly, fished the rivers, traded lumber, ferried loads, repaired boats, planted and harvested with a fury that astonished those who watched. Every coin he earned carried the weight of his family's names. Every season brought him back to a table where someone else claimed the right to sell him those he loved. There were setbacks, a promised manumission delayed, a child's price raised without warning, the insult of having to prove, again, that he had earned what he brought. Venture learned to arrive with witnesses, to demand tallies in writing, to hold men to their own words. He had wrestled with storms on the Atlantic and with winters that bit through bone. Now he wrestled with the small, cold calculations of men who could profit from a husband's desperation. Piece by piece, he succeeded. First himself, then, one by one, his family. Each freedom purchased was a link broken from a chain the world had told him could never be snapped. There is a kind of courage that charges a line of muskets. There is another kind that gets up every day to do backbreaking work, hands over the earnings, and returns to do it again, refusing to let the flame go out. Venture's courage was of the second kind, the endurance that turns years into a weapon. When the last bargain was sealed, when the final receipt was folded away, Venture stood not as a solitary survivor, but as a man who had rebuilt a family inside a system meant to destroy families. Freedom for him was not an abstraction. It was the ability to decide where his children slept, the certainty that no man could sell his wife, the right to wake up and know that the day's labor fed his own household. And yet, even with freedom won, another truth pressed in. The world outside slavery did not welcome black freedom. Prejudice shadowed his steps. Laws and customs still conspired to keep him poor, to keep him frightened, to keep him out. Venture met this next chapter as he had met all the others, by working, by saving, by building something that could not easily be taken. Land, tools, boats, a livelihood that tied his name to a place and his labor to his own table. The price of freedom, then, was paid across 3 ledgers. First, in money, the coins that bought signatures and sealed manumissions. Second, in the body, the muscles spent, the skin scarred, the years burned away like fuel. Third, in memory, the pain carried forward, not to cripple, but to remind. Venture would use all 3 accounts to fund the rest of his life. Ahead lay the work of a free man, staking claims, buying acreage, hiring help, weathering debts and seasons, raising children who would know days he had been denied. Ahead lay a book, his book, where he would dictate the truth of a life the world had tried to silence. But before that would come the simple, profound act of standing on land, not owned by another man, and feeling for the first time the full weight and the full lightness of being free. He had purchased his liberty. Now he would learn to live it. Freedom was not the end of Venture Smith's struggle. It was the beginning of a new kind of battle. Once he had secured liberty for himself and his family, he entered a world where freedom existed in name, but hostility and prejudice surrounded every step. The colonies of New England were not welcoming places for black men, whether enslaved or free. The law might no longer call him property, but society still saw him as less than human. Venture, however, refused to live as though freedom were a fragile gift. He treated it as a foundation. His first act as a free man was to claim something that could not easily be taken from him: land. In Connecticut, near the town of East Haddam, he purchased acreage along the Salmon River. For a black man in colonial America, land ownership was more than property. It was a declaration of independence. It meant that his labor no longer enriched a master. It meant that his children would inherit something that could not be sold out from under them. On this land, Venture built a life, brick by brick, plank by plank. He cleared forests, planted fields, raised livestock, and worked the river. His towering strength, once exploited by enslavers, was now bent toward his own survival and prosperity. Neighbors watched with astonishment at his ability to split wood, haul stone, and carve a farmstead from the wilderness. The very strength that had once been their excuse for valuing him as a commodity now became the source of his independence. But building a life meant more than physical labor. Venture turned to business. He became a fisherman, trader, and lumberman, ferrying goods along the Connecticut River. His reputation for honesty was so strong that even in a society steeped in racism, some white neighbors trusted his word more than paper contracts. That reputation mattered. It gave him leverage in a world where suspicion of black men was constant. Still, prejudice did not vanish. Venture was forced to defend his property against those who believed a black man had no right to land. He endured legal battles, theft, and harassment. Yet, time and again, he fought back, in court, in negotiations, and, when necessary, with his own fists. His size and strength became legendary, but it was his determination that defined him. Life as a free man brought both joy and sorrow. Venture and Meg raised their children with the dignity that slavery had tried to deny them. But freedom could not shield them from tragedy. Some of their children died young, a reminder that liberty did not mean immunity from suffering. Still, Venture pressed on, ensuring that his surviving family inherited not only land, but also the story of how it was won. By the 1790s, Venture was known across Connecticut. His stature, both physical and moral, made him a figure of awe. He was said to stand 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighing over 300 pounds, with a presence that intimidated even armed men. Stories circulated of how he fought off attackers, defended his family, and carried logs that would have broken others' backs. For Venture, strength had always been survival. Now, as a free man, it was also protection, proof that no one could ever again chain him without a fight. But Venture's greatest achievement was not land or reputation. It was legacy. He had clawed his way from captivity as a 6-year-old child stolen from Africa, survived the Middle Passage, endured decades of enslavement, and purchased not only his own freedom, but that of his wife and children. In doing so, he carved out a place in history as one of the first Africans in America to leave behind a full, dictated autobiography. Still, that part of the story lay just ahead. In these years on the Salmon River, Venture was not thinking of books. He was thinking of survival, of family, of ensuring that no one could undo what he had fought for. Every acre of cleared land, every net cast into the river, every debt repaid was part of his declaration: I am free and my freedom will last. Freedom was not easy. It was not safe, but it was his. And in the soil of Connecticut, Venture Smith built a life that no master could claim, a life that testified to the resilience of a man who had once been stolen and silenced, but who now lived and thrived on his own terms. By the 1790s, Venture Smith was no longer only a survivor. He was a free landowner, a husband, a father, and a figure of awe across Connecticut. Yet Venture understood something profound. Freedom alone was not enough if his story vanished with him. He had endured what countless others had endured, but unlike most, he had a chance to speak it aloud, to leave behind words that slavery could not erase. In 1798, Venture dictated his life story to a group of abolition-minded editors in Connecticut. The result was a slim but extraordinary volume titled A Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Venture, a Native of Africa. It was not written in ornate language or embellished with dramatic flourishes. It was plain, unvarnished, and brutally direct. And that was its power. In those pages, Venture described his capture as a child in Africa, the murder of his father, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and the endless years of exploitation in New England. He recounted the betrayals he suffered as he tried to buy his freedom, the punishments he endured for resisting, and the staggering sums he paid to liberate himself and his family. He did not soften his words to spare readers. He named the injustice plainly. The narrative was groundbreaking. At a time when many white Americans justified slavery by claiming Africans were less than human, here was Venture Smith, in his own words, demolishing that lie. He spoke with the clarity of a man who had lived both freedom and bondage, whose testimony could not be ignored. His story was among the first published slave narratives in American history, decades before the famous works of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs. Though only 32 pages long, Venture's autobiography carried immense weight. It offered an African-born perspective that was rare in print. Most enslaved Africans did not live to tell their stories, and even fewer had the chance to publish them. Venture's words connected the soil of Africa to the fields of America, showing that those who had been stolen were not nameless, not voiceless. They had memories, families, and legacies. The book also revealed the staggering economic injustice of slavery. Venture detailed the exact sums he paid: over 71 pounds, 2 shillings for his own freedom, and much more for his wife and children. Readers could see in black and white the cruel arithmetic of bondage, how a man was forced to buy back what should never have been stolen. For abolitionists, Venture's narrative became evidence, living proof of slavery's brutality and of the humanity of those it sought to destroy. For Venture himself, it was something deeper, a final act of resistance. He had survived enslavement. He had reclaimed his family. Now he would ensure that his voice outlived him, that generations to come would know that he had once been free, then enslaved, and then free again. To this day, the autobiography of Venture Smith stands as a rare window into the 18th century world of slavery in New England. It shatters the myth that slavery was only a Southern institution, reminding us that bondage was woven into the very fabric of the Northern colonies as well. Venture, who had once been stripped of his name, had the last word. He told his story in his own voice, and by doing so, he became not just a man who purchased his freedom, but a man who preserved the truth. His book was his monument, a defiant record, carved not in stone, but in ink. Proof that even when enslavers tried to erase him, Venture Smith endured. In 1805, Venture Smith's long struggle came to an end. He died in East Haddam, Connecticut, at about 76 years old. a remarkable age for someone who had endured enslavement, back-breaking labor, and a lifetime of struggle. He was buried not as property, not as a nameless man in an unmarked grave, but as Venture Smith, freeholder, husband, father, and author of his own life. His gravestone still stands in the burying ground of the First Church of East Haddam. It is a simple stone, weathered by centuries, but its presence is profound. For an African child stolen at 6 years old, who survived the Middle Passage and bought back his freedom, that stone is more than a marker. It is a declaration. He lived, he endured, and he left his name behind. But Venture's story did not die with him. His children and descendants carried on his legacy, holding the land he had fought to purchase, remembering the sacrifices he made to secure their futures. Oral histories preserved his memory, and his narrative, published in 1798, ensured that his voice reached beyond his family to the world. In the centuries that followed, Venture's autobiography became a cornerstone in the study of slavery in New England. Too often, Americans told themselves that slavery was only the South's burden. Venture's life shattered that illusion. His testimony proved that bondage reached into the North, into Connecticut and Rhode Island, and into the very foundation of a nation that claimed to value liberty. Today, scholars, historians, and descendants alike honor Venture Smith not only for his survival, but for his refusal to remain silent. His life is now studied in classrooms, his narrative quoted in books, his grave visited by those who seek to understand the human cost of slavery. Schools in Connecticut bear his name, and exhibits in museums tell his story. Each act of remembrance pushes back against the centuries of erasure that sought to silence men like him. Venture's legacy reaches beyond history books. His life embodies universal truths, that human dignity can survive even the harshest chains, that family bonds can drive extraordinary sacrifice, and that voices once silenced can still echo centuries later. He reminds us that freedom is never given. It is fought for, earned, and defended, often at unbearable cost. And yet, Venture's story is not only about suffering, it is also about triumph. He endured betrayal after betrayal and still managed to buy back his life. He turned forced labor into the foundation of independence. He transformed pain into testimony, dictating one of the first African autobiographies in America. His life challenges us to remember that behind every statistic of the slave trade was a human being, with a name, a family, a voice. More than 2 centuries after his death, the story of Venture Smith is still unfolding. Every time his name is spoken, every time a student reads his words, every time a visitor stands before his gravestone, the boy once called Brotier Furrow is remembered not as property, not as a statistic, but as a man who lived free. In the end, Venture Smith's greatest victory was not simply the purchase of his freedom, it was the survival of his story, a story that continues to speak, reminding us of the cost of slavery, the power of endurance, and the unbreakable will of a man who refused to be erased.